So the other weapon that was or one of the other weapons requested was quarterstaff. Unfortunately, I don't have a quarterstaff with me tonight, but I do have some. I do have a long stick, and I mean, as Victorian era quarterstaffs were about 7 foot long. They were 7 foot of bamboo, apparently solid bamboo, which I thought was just rattan, but apparently it's not. There is like types of bamboo that are solid all the way through, but still light and flexible. Um, so, you know, like sword versus quarterstaff was a possibility in the period, like people would have done it. And yeah, so the first kind of solution would, if you're faced with a quarterstaff, or you know, is to fight in a place with a low roof, because this weapon gets a lot harder to use when there's any kind of encumbrance, which I think, like, a lot of people say, oh, but you know, in a one-on-one fight, the quarterstaff has such a huge advantage, which I think it's more that we just haven't cracked sword versus quarterstaff, because there is presumably a reason why people wore swords for self-defense, or carried swords with them for self-defense, and not staves, when like quarterstaves were like sticks this length or a bit longer were still really, really common. I mean, there's a reference in George Silver's book where he says a Italian rapier master got in an argument with a bargeman who had a big long barge pole, which they then used to cave in the rapier master's head. So, you know, it's like, and yet like people still carried swords, and I suspect there's more to it than just the convenience of carry, because people did have the sticks handy, and also more to it than just the status. Like, I do suspect there's more to sword versus quarterstaff than we've really worked out yet. But again, like, there's not a lot of people around the world who do quarterstaff, and also there's not a lot of safe ways to bout with quarterstaff. So, yeah, like, getting in any kind of terrain is going to give a huge advantage to the person with the sword, because, you know, like, I sword fight in this room all the time, and for some reason, I only really seem to ever hit the roof when I'm doing demos, when I'm doing these lessons. When I'm actually fencing, I don't, which is weird. Probably jinxed it now. In terms of things you have to worry about with the quarterstaff, one is the reach. So even like you know, a 7 foot quarterstaff has a considerable reach over a sabre, let alone a cutlass. So, you know, like, you're going to have to deal with a much longer weapon. So same rules, the bayonet. Be very careful about backing up, because if you back up, there's every chance that you're just going to get hit from very far away. And same sort of movement patterns as well. You want to basically zigzag in your opponent to close with them. But unlike, say, the bayonet, which has a very narrow kind of, you know, arc of attack, the quarterstaff has a big, you know, can come in from, you know, basically a lot of different directions, and it has two ends that can be the same length. It's not like, say, the bayonet, where a butt stroke has a much shorter reach than, you know, the weapon. I'll have to switch weapons to show you this, but, you know, the weapon you can change hands with the weapon, and this is in fact how someone says to do it in a room with a high ceiling. So both ends have a similar amount of reach. So the other issue as well is, because the weapon is so long, the amount of leverage you can get from it, and because this tip will travel a very long way, it means can hit very, very hard. And I think Paul Wagner of Staccato School of Defense pointed out that in most cases, a proper like oak quarterstaff could blast through most sword parries. There is still a way to parry, however. It's called a seeding parry. So the idea is basically, when I resist my opponent, I don't put all of my alignment into perfecting my resistance. For multiple reasons. One is this sacrifices the sort of alignments I'd want to return my attack. But the other is there's no redundancy in this. This either works or it doesn't. So if I get blasted through, I get blasted through, or more like my sword's going to get smashed in my hand. Conversely, if I parry using This sort of system of parries that we see in the 19th century, you know, my blade is an angle so to guide my opponent's sword to my forte. You know, my elbow is open enough that any force coming in is either going to force it more open or push my shoulder rather than actually collapsing my parry. What this means is when a blow comes in that I can't stop, I can redirect it. And so long as I'm not tense, I'm not tensing every muscle in a death grip, I will naturally do that. My sword will naturally be knocked around to somewhere. So if a quarterstaff blow comes in high and hits here, I will naturally want to, and hits here, as it pushes on my elbow. All I do is lift my elbow up, or it pushes on my shoulder, and I will naturally lift my elbow up, which will push the blow up and around me and come to the other side. And I have actually done this as part of a demo of what to do with a quarterstaff. You're attacked by 3 people with swords. And I was meant to be being nice because the quarterstaff was meant to win, but I got, the quarterstaff person came at me, struck and swung at me to try and blast my parry 3 times. I just kept instinctively doing this and rolling around them and displacing them. At which point, the 4th time, they realized that what I was doing and then disengaged and stabbed me in the face, which, fair enough. But yeah, that's basically, you want to seed your parries. So against a quarterstaff, seed your parries and come to the outside of the weapon. So if I don't want to stand in front of the person with the quarterstaff. I don't want to, you know, stand and bang, to use boxing, specifically boxing terminology. If I'm, you know, in front, the quarterstaff can basically just wail from whatever direction. And it's got, you know, and parrying that is going to be a nightmare. Certainly I'm not going to have any time to riposte myself. So what I want to do is I want to get to this side of the weapon, or alternatively this side of the weapon. I want to get to the outside. So that way, and I want some control, so that way that way I won't get hit by the other end. And the seating parries do that. So if I'm seating here, I'm now outside the weapon, at which point I can reach out and grab it and, you know, then do the swordy stuff. Same on the other side. I hit. When the attack comes in and lands, I just transition to high octave, displacing it, grab and cut. You know, that's kind of your that's sort of how you get around the fact that they can blast through you. Still not necessarily easy because the tip moves quite quickly, but possible. So again, parry, seed, parry, seed, parry, seed, parry, seed. If they're coming low, you know, if they're coming low, so like at a rising strike, I'm going to have to do a circular parry. Blows coming in like that. I don't want to oppose it. I want to sweep it. So just draw a circle with my tip. And hopefully that's going to tangle their arms enough to give me a return attack, time for a return attack. Same on the other side, if the person's coming in here at my leg, or even, you know, my torso, seed, I'm basically trying to sweep it past me, which does kind of break the rule of don't back off, but, you know, this is the exception that proves the rule. I seed and come back. So, and come back, sweep and come back, sweep and come back, sweep and come back. So these are basically like the counter parries of foil or epee, you know, these circular parries, which do work quite well with sabre as well, or cutlass, and are really cool. Additionally, I have the same problem as well with the quarterstaff that I have against the bayonet, where the person can beat. So I deal with that basically the same way, where I try and stop them from moving my hand by putting extra movement in my tip. So the way that I stop my hand from being moved is I make sure that the tip moves as much as possible. So if the tip has to go all the way out to here, then it goes all the way out to here. So I can, because if my hand is driven wide, that's when I'm in a lot of trouble. Although with the quarterstaff, you have the same problem with from the other side. So not only can I be beaten this way, I can also be beaten this way. So with that, again, I want to keep my hand, I basically want to keep my hand from moving, and I want to move away from the strike and parry, which then has the problem that I might potentially move towards the other end. So you do have to be very, very careful. You know, if I get beaten this way, I might even, you know, I might then have to quickly parry again this way, and then hope for the, you know, and then hope for the best. The other advice I have against the quarterstaff is if you employ a hanging parry of any kind, so second, prime, head guard, throw your riposte to the outside of the weapon. So you know, if I'm here and I throw, I'm basically driving the person this way. So yeah, that's sort of, that's how I'd approach a quarterstaff. You know, seating parries are important. It's a bit more difficult than the bayonet because unlike the bayonet where you can engage closer to seek an advantage, with the quarterstaff, you kind of can't, because until you can choke the weapon up, it's all bad. I mean, you could potentially, if the person's making a blow that you feel is fairly reliable, fairly predictable, you're like, if you're confident they're coming in this way, surging in aggressively with your parry to get close is a good idea, because you know the quarterstaff is a bludgeoning weapon, so if you can get close enough to choke it up, to wear a few, then you should, especially if you can get to grapple distance. In fact, the main thing with the big weakness of the quarterstaff is when someone, you know, if your opponent, or if you have got a quarterstaff and you get wrestled, it becomes a big liability. It's a very, very easy weapon to, well, it's a very difficult weapon to maneuver in close. And, you know, if you've got a quarterstaff and someone closes on you, the best thing to do is to drop the quarterstaff as quickly as you can and just start wrestling. I think there is actually advice in Elizabethan manuals that says, as soon as your opponent comes close, basically shove your quarterstaff at them, drop it, pull out your dagger and dagger them, because that's all you really can do. But yeah, that's my advice against quarterstaff. And I don't want to underestimate, it is a much more difficult prospect than bayonet, because there's so many more angles of attack and there's so much more speed and ferocity in the attack. I don't buy that you can't parry. I think you can with the seating parries, although that does restrict your options in terms of tactics. But yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, the most reliable way to deal with a quarterstaff is to be in a moderately confined space. I mean, honestly, this room that I regularly sword fight in is not really suitable for quarterstaff use, because of the low ceiling. And if I walked a little bit that way to where there's some furniture, the weapon's kind of useless, which might also explain why they weren't very popular as self-defense weapons compared to swords, because swords are still quite good in confined or confined-ish spaces, even quite long one, like the longer Elizabethan broadswords, let alone like a sabre or a cutlass. Whereas, yeah, quarterstaff, I mean, I don't see it being very effective, you know, in a pub or in an alleyway or in a forest or a lightly wooded area. So yeah, so I think it's probably the, as much as, you know, when in an open area or flat ground where you're starting as a duel, they've got a huge advantage. They probably lose that advantage very, very quickly as soon as any complications come along, which is why they weren't so popular. Cool, so are there any questions before we move on? So the curate points out, that would always be why a gentleman carried a cane or a stick. Yeah, well actually, so it's theorized that jogo de pau, which is the Portuguese great stick method, started because travelers would have a big long sort of hiking stick thing, and they'd use it to fend off bandits, which is kind of kind of cool. So yeah, I mean, imagine because there certainly are a lot of cases of like sticks being used historically. They just don't seem to. It mostly seems to be in urban areas um, where swords are favoured. So yeah, out in the wilderness and not in a forest, having having a big stick's probably a very useful thing. So mixed point out. Oh yeah, mixed point out used to be part of the Boy Scouts Master at Arms. It did. Quarterstaff fighting got really super popular in Victorian Britain, and this is super duper interesting because quarterstaff was very popular in Britain up until about the 17th, I think actually early 18th into the early 18th century. It was really popular, and then it just declined. When we get to when we get to the early 19th century, there's scarcely mention of it until 1842, when there was a display of quarterstaff done by two Frenchmen in I think London. I think it was London. It was certainly one of the major cities at the time, major industrial cities. And that sort of rekindled the British interest in quarterstaff. And then it became super popular with the Victorians to the point where when you get to the 1870s, quarterstaff is a really common weapon in fencing schools. It's a really common weapon in really common weapon in fencing schools. It's really common in self-defense manuals. So Allinson Wynne has it. Hutton has Great Stick, which is basically quarterstaff, although his method is based on continental stick fighting methods. But yeah, it was trained. The army trained it. It was one of the weapons that the army did. Which is also why it's a Boy Scout weapon. One of the Boy Scout sticks. The Boy Scouts had like single stick, foil, and quarterstaff as their weapons. The weapons for the Master of Arms badge, I believe. I think it's either single stick or broadsword. But yeah, it just got super popular again, and it's really interesting because there's a lot of. It's seen as a very very British weapon. Like they even Hutton says, yeah, oh yeah, the quarterstaff is an old British weapon, particularly because of Robin Hood stuff. Excuse I. And yeah, it's really interesting that it disappeared for, a period probably less than 100 years, but it disappeared for a period when there were two-handed stick systems still going on in the continent, and then came back, then made a comeback in the late 19th century. I don't buy the theories that there was an unbroken tradition that just wasn't documented. For that to be true, you need a very heavily documented weapon to suddenly go underground, still be practiced in a period where more and more things are being documented. Like we have some very fringe weapon traditions documented in the 19th century. And sure, not all are. There are, weapons that were talked about, but we don't have any technical manuals for them. But you look at the sources for quarterstaff, it disappeared in Britain and then came back. It came back as part of the interest in historical weapons, although it was one of the first historical weapons to be revived and became exceedingly popular for a period. So yeah, that's condensed history of quarterstaff in Victorian Britain. Cool. So, are there any more questions before we move on? Take that as no.